Welcome back, everybody. This is our first Women in Literature class in Frankenstein. So, what I wanted to do today was to introduce the novel. If you'll remember last class, we talked a little bit about the cult of true womanhood in order to get a sense as to what the history of the time might have been like. And then we read a short story by Kay Chopin, The Story of an Hour, to try to give us a sense of how authors might have been rebelling against some of the social expectations of their time period. And in fact, in today's notes, you might see that I have posted a picture. It's a picture of something that I would normally pass around in class because it's framed in my office. But I took a picture of it the last time I was in my office so that I could share it with you online. And you can see the title is College Bad for Girls? And this was a true publication that was distributed by doctors actually to their patients in the early 1900s, as you can see from this picture. And as I'm fond of saying, you can't make this stuff up. And I think this picture just helps to reinforce the idea of what some of the social norms of the time were and illustrates how the authors that we're going to be reading over the course of this semester really defied the expectations of their time. We're starting with the novel Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is an interesting novel written by Mary Shelley. She happens to be the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft was quite the feminist. So Mary Shelley had a background in the idea of feminism. And if you know anything about the construction of the story itself, Mary Shelley was vacationing with her husband, Percy Shelley, the very famous romantic poet, and a couple of friends, and they were experiencing some poor weather. So, in order to amuse themselves, because they were indoors, they decided to have a short story competition, or at least a competition in terms of some sort of a horror tale, whether it be short story or novel. And everyone went back and tried to create their tale. And Mary Shelley that night had a horrible nightmare about what's come to be called the famous creation scene in Frankenstein, where the creature is actually brought back to life. And she turned that into her famous novel. Now, that said, she gave her manuscript to her husband, Percy Shelley, for his opinion, and he suggested that she lengthen it, which she did. I'll let you decide as a reader if you think that was a good piece of advice or not. One of the things you'll find when you're reading Frankenstein is that there are these long passages that are just very descriptive of the natural world. I would suggest that those are important just because of the period at that time, the Romantic movement in writing, where the emphasis was on the natural world and the beauty of the natural world. And also, I wanted to talk a little bit about Mary Shelley's perspectives about nature in relation to gender. So that's a little bit of a spoiler alert that we'll be talking about in the next class. But at any rate, he not only gave her suggestions in terms of expanding her text, but he also made some edits. And there's been some controversy about that, about whether or not we can legitimately say that this is entirely her text because of his influence. I think it's ridiculous. I personally wonder if that question is asked purely because Mary Shelley is a woman, because if things were the other way around, my suspicion is that no one would in any way be surprised that there was some editorial help. I think it's the way that most writers write, is they send off their manuscripts to individuals for feedback and edits. But nevertheless, this story, written as part of this horror story competition, has become part of our popular culture. And a little bit of interesting trivia is that one of the members on their vacation, Dr. Polidori, wrote a story called The Vampire. And it's thought that Bram Stoker of Dracula fame used that story, The Vampire, to help inspire some of what he came up with in terms of Dracula. So that was a very important night in terms of Gothic literature. And that says something about this story, Frankenstein, as well, because it straddles lots of different genres. I definitely talk about this text in my Gothic literature class because it is a classic in terms of horror film and Gothic literature, in part because of the 1930s Universal Studios movie, which I'll talk about briefly in a few minutes. But also, I think it straddles the idea of science fiction, and in fact, it's a text that oftentimes is examined in science fiction classes. If you've just begun the novel, perhaps you can get a sense as to how it might be applicable for both of those genres, but certainly as you continue your reading, you'll find that. And then finally, this idea of using it as a kind of feminist text, which for our class, Women in Literature, is an interesting text to begin with, in the sense that this is a very male centric text, which is somewhat surprising because Mary Shelley was a female. So, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves as we continue on with our reading is, why would this female author make the decision to give us so many central male characters? And there could be lots of reasons for that answer, or lots of reasons for that. And we'll talk about several of them as we continue to examine Frankenstein. My hope, as you know, was that ideally you would have finished the novel in its entirety during the first class out of the several classes that I had assigned for us to talk about it. But I'm also a realist, and I'm well aware that you may be in the beginning or in the midst of your reading as well. So what I wanted to do today was just to basically introduce the idea of Frankenstein for those of you who haven't necessarily finished the reading, and talk a little bit about the very famous 1930s Universal Studio film, which has become part of our popular culture, directed by James Whale, and basically helped to establish Boris Karloff's career since he played the creature. I can tell you right now that the book that Mary Shelley wrote is very different from the Hollywood film, in terms of the plot, in terms of the structure, even in terms of character names, which is one of the confusing things of seeing the 1930s film, is that some of the names are flipped around to different characters, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be next class. And definitely the length. Frankenstein is a long tale, and it's a tale embedded within a tale. There's a term for that. It's called the epistolary novel, when we're told a story through letters. And we'll examine that a little bit further next class as well, in terms of the construction of the story. But that was probably too difficult to translate over into film, especially in the early days of film. So we get a very simplified retelling of the story. And one of the things that I was hopeful that you could do is watch that 1930s Frankenstein film. I've included a link for it so that you can access it online. It's approximately an hour and 10 minutes. Keep in mind that you would be watching this film less for understanding the novel and more for understanding how Frankenstein has become this cultural icon in our society. And in fact, I thought we could use that film as today's attendance question. Just asking for our discussion board today, did you like or dislike the 1930s film version of Frankenstein? And briefly, your reasoning why. And in terms of thinking about the discussion board, as I had said, that you're answering the attendance question basically satisfies your attendance for that class. And you are free to interact with your peers on the discussion board as much or as little as you'd like, much like you would do in an in-class situation. I encourage you to read all of your peer comments because that'll give you lots of different perspectives. And as you are reading them, if anything occurs to you that you wanted to state, certainly you can do that in the discussion board. So you can decide how much or how little you would participate in terms of responding to your peers in the discussion board, much like you would do in an in-person class in terms of deciding how much or how little you might want to respond to your peers in class. I had also talked a little bit about some of the ways that we can make this class a little bit more interactive and still accommodate some of the challenges that all of us are facing now. And the idea of using extra credits seemed to make sense. And I basically was able to review your comments in terms of time availability and also in terms of preferred format. So I've got a tentative time, a suggested time. I'd love your feedback on it. My thinking is that we could meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays for approximately a half hour starting at 12 to 12:30, and that this would begin starting next Tuesday. And that on Tuesdays we could have a live chat, and on Thursdays, we could have a Zoom so that we could accommodate different learning styles. So please let me know. Via email is fine if you'd like, but you can also do that in the comments as well in your discussion board as to what you are thinking about those particular times in that particular format. Again, this is not a requirement of the class. This would be extra credit if any of you wanted to interact with me and with your classmates via chat. We could do that on Tuesdays, and you could do the same via Zoom on Thursdays. In relation to your journals, your first journal is going to be about Frankenstein. So if you've noticed that your first journal is not going to be due until after we've spent several classes talking about Frankenstein, that was done deliberately so that you could utilize some of what we've discussed in relation to the text. And the journals are meant to be informal. I'm thinking about approximately a page or so of reflections or questions or thoughts, elements that perhaps we've discussed in Zoom or in chat, or perhaps elements I've discussed in video, or things that have been brought up in discussion boards, or perhaps something that hasn't come up yet that you would like to address. And I'm not evaluating these journals for grammar or mechanics. Basically, it's for content, and we're having a kind of conversation on paper. And your first journal is going to be due on the 11th of June by midnight via email to me, either in a PDF document or a Word document. And again, if you needed additional time, just ask me for an extension. I'd be happy to grant that for you. I had also indicated that I had some suggested paper topics, and I put that in the folder entitled Syllabus and Other Documents. And I wanted to talk, as we continue the semester, I wanted to talk a little bit more about papers, how to construct a paper, and some of the topics that I'm suggesting. But keep in mind that you can come up with your own topics. So as you are reading Frankenstein and all of the other texts, if something occurs to you, certainly you're free to run it by me or to discuss it in a discussion board, and it could be something that you could translate over into a more formal investigation. In fact, many times students will end up trying out an idea for a paper in their journal that satisfies the journal requirement, and then based on my comments and so forth, that helps them decide whether or not they want to pursue that idea in further depth in the papers, and that's a very efficient use of time as far as I'm concerned. So the film, as I said, is approximately an hour and 10 minutes. So enjoy. And I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are about this particular film. I realize that many of you may have never seen this film before. I found that as classes progress, fewer and fewer students over the years have watched this film. Though if you've seen it before, watching it with a fresh eye, especially now that you're beginning to delve into the novel, can be very enlightening as well. So next class, we'll begin to discuss the novel right at the very beginning, by the way. People oftentimes forget that the title of the book is not Frankenstein. The title of the book is Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So that will be how we begin, talking a little bit about Prometheus. And then we'll continue forward and talking about the format of the book. So I hope you're well. I'm well. Enjoy the film. And we will touch base again on Thursday. Take care.